1994, the year of Boyz II Men's baby-making banger, I'll Make Love to You. Warren G. and Nate Dogg's Regulate, the tragic suicide of Kurt Cobain, and the birth of Justin Bieber. American was in the throes of grunge, a revolution in hip-hop, and the rejection of the bright sunniness and colors of the 80s. But it was a continuation of the 80s' unprecedented interest in the sport of bodybuilding. In 1980, Arnold won a controversial 7th Mr. Olympia after coming out of a 5-year retirement, and the very first Miss Olympia was won by Rachel McLish. The 80s saw a boom in the interest of health, wellness, sculpting the perfect physique, and arguably, it was the biggest decade in bodybuilding. The 90s continued to ride the wave of 80s bodybuilding interest, and bodybuilding gyms were massively popular, particularly in coastal areas where you could showcase your sculpted arms and abs all year long. Places like Miami. In 1994, Sun Gym in Miami was run by New York-raised and slick-talking Daniel Lugo. It featured weight machines, a juice bar, vitamins, Nautilus equipment, and, if you knew who to ask, steroids you could buy right in the comfort of the locker room. For Lugo, this would be the tip of the iceberg. There was just so much money to be made if you knew the right crew and you kidnapped the right person. In the most preposterous true crime story I have ever read, we are headed to sunny Miami to talk steroids, kidnapping, grown men dressed as ninjas, and murder. Today we're hitting the road and exploring the life and crimes of the Sun Gym Gang and today's lucky number 7 episode of Highway to Hell. Hello and welcome back to Highway to Hell, the travel and true crime podcast where we explore crime and paranormal activity across the country and the world, and I give you travel recommendations when you go visit these cities. My name is Monty Mater. I'm a non-drug using fitness geek, rock vocalist, a steak connoisseur, and an aspiring soulless vampire. Thank you again so much to everyone who has been listening to the podcast and subscribing. I now have 51 subscribers on Spotify alone, which is kind of a big deal. Love that. Appreciate the support. And as you listen this week, if you could do me the biggest favor of sharing this episode to your Facebook wall or your Instagram story, just so people know that this is here. Your support means a lot. And please, of course, continue to rate and share this podcast. It really means a lot to me, and it's given me so much life. And if you're watching on YouTube and you see me in a hoodie and a messy bun, clearly looking a little bit tired, I drove from New Orleans, which was my official vacation. I'm back in Nashville, as you can see from my poster wall. And this month of travel and living in my car and seeing all these cities and meeting new people just really brought me back to life as a person. And while I'm super happy to see my cats, who are shockingly not angry at me for being gone for a month, I'm not super excited about being back in Nashville. But the month away gave me a lot of clarity on what I want my life to look like, what I want to be investing my time in, who I want to be investing that time with. And I'm going to be making a lot of major life changes in the next few months. I am the queen of the bold decision. When I get an idea and I know what I want to do, I just do it and I do crazy things. So I'll keep you updated on the podcast. I will still be traveling 2 weeks of the month. I have a backlog of research and episodes ready. But yeah, stay tuned both here and on my socials, which is just Monty Mater. Monty is M-O-N-T-E. And it's going to be a wild year. By this time next year, life is going to be totally different. And I can promise you I won't be in this apartment. Surprise, surprise. Anyways. But again, thank you for telling people so that they can join the road trip with us. Today's episode is, again, the most preposterous true crime story I've ever heard. I was actually laughing out loud hysterically in a coffee shop researching this, and I had to fact check it so many times because I just could not believe that it's real. And it's terrible because people did get hurt, but it's also like really freaking hilarious. So there's going to be a lot of dark humor, terrible Arnold impressions. And if you've ever seen the movie Pain and Gain, we're talking about that story. Pain and Gain is based on a true story, the Michael Bay film. So much muscle, so little brain. Today, we're going to discuss the crimes of the Sun Gym Gang in Miami. We're going to particularly focus on their team leader, Daniel Lugo, their crimes of kidnapping, extortion, assault, and murder. And the way that I've structured this episode is we'll do a brief history of bodybuilding, because as I was talking about this to people that I know and friends and clients, I realized I've worked in gyms because I'm an exercise physiologist. I've worked in gyms for 15 years now. I've been around bodybuilders for a very long time. And I sometimes forget that people are not familiar with bodybuilding at all. And I got my start in fitness with a personal weight loss of 90 pounds. And I've been I lived this life minus the steroids. But I'm going to give a brief history of bodybuilding for those of you that are just not familiar with it at all, especially the boom of the 80s, which was a big bodybuilding decade. I'm going to discuss a brief intro of the gang team leader, Daniel Lugo, and then we're going to talk about the crime spree. Again, just grab your popcorn, grab a drink, unless you're driving, don't do that, and just settle in for something that is truly hilarious and tragic all at once. Let's jump in. History of bodybuilding. Bodybuilding is a sport centered around physical development and aesthetic appearance. This is not about performance. I used to work as an assistant strength coach for the world bench press champion Bill Gillespie, and the way that he described bodybuilders was they look like Tarzan and they play like Jane. This is meant to be, I look good, I don't run fast, okay? This is achieved through a combination of weight training, diet, and sometimes supplements. Always supplements and sometimes drugs. Its history can be traced back to the 19th century with Eugen Sandow, who's often referred to as the father of modern bodybuilding. Sandow, who was celebrated for his muscular physique, made public exhibitions of his body, which he sculpted based on classical Greek statues presenting ideal proportions. When you look at pictures of Sandow, he just looks kind of like a lean, athletic man. Like this form of bodybuilding, quotation marks, is not what we think of now. Like if he had his clothes on, you'd just think he was the average dude. But he was the first person that really turned this into kind of an exhibition sport. For the sport of bodybuilding, the 1940s to the 1970s is known as the golden era of bodybuilding. This period saw the rise of icons like Steve Reeves and later Arnold Schwarzenegger, who brought widespread popularity to the sport. And actually prior to this, I didn't put this in my notes, but Sean Connery was actually important to the evolution of bodybuilding. It was during this era that Joe Weider founded the International Federation of Bodybuilding and Fitness, or the IFBB, and began publishing muscle magazines and promoting the sport. Bodybuilding competitions became more organized and more popular over time. The Mr. Olympia contest, established in 1965 by Joe and Ben Weider, quickly became the most prestigious competition in the sport. And again, for those of you that are like, I have no concept of bodybuilding except for big muscles, think of Mr. Olympia is the Miss Universe of bodybuilding. That's what it is. So this is WWE meets Miss Universe World Championships. Now you got it. Just lock that in. That's your visual. Arnold Schwarzenegger's victories in Mr. Olympia, he won 7 times from 1970 to 1980, were particularly influential because they coincided with his burgeoning film career, further boosting the sport's profile. In the 1980s and beyond, bodybuilding continued to evolve with advances in training techniques, nutrition, and supplementation, and drugs. The 80s saw wildly popular athletes like Tom Platz, who's known for his insane leg development and became arguably the most popular and highest earning bodybuilder of the 80s. Tom Platz's legs were the size of my torso. And again, for those of you that are like, I don't know what you look like, I'm 5'10", and I weigh about 165 pounds, and this man's quad is the size of the main portion of my body. And matter of fact, I'm going to show you a picture. So if you're watching on YouTube, I'm going to put up a quick picture of this man's legs. Okay, so again, for those of you that are just listening, you can't see this, but I wanted to show the people on YouTube. And obviously this man just looks like a juice canoe. I mean, he's blonde hair, chiseled face, like so many muscles, but look at the size of his legs. Like it's preposterous legs. It's preposterous. Like I'm pretty sure that one of his quadriceps is the size of my face. But this is what Tom Platz was famous for. He's arguably the most popular bodybuilder, probably maybe next to Arnold, and he was definitely the highest paid. With the dawn of the 80s, the sport also became more inclusive. There was the introduction of women's bodybuilding, and they had categories like physique, figure, and bikini competitions, which were catered to different aesthetic goals for the women beyond traditional, just as much mass as you can possibly put on. The IFBB is the governing body of the professional bodybuilding, and in 1982, the National Physique Committee became the primary organization for amateur bodybuilders. The 80s saw the continuation in anabolic steroid use for bodybuilders, which is why you see such a dramatic increase in size between the 60s Olympia winners and the 80s Olympia winners. That's the drugs. Steroids did not become a Schedule III drug classified with narcotics until 1990. The use of synthetic steroids in sports began in the 1950s. Testosterone and its synthetic derivatives were first developed and used to enhance muscle mass and performance. Initially, their use was relatively unregulated, and they were popular in athletes in strength and power sports. The Soviets were pioneers in this. Of course they were. Of course they were. This immediately makes me think of Rocky IV with Ivan Drago, and they're like, he's just in there just punching, and he's, and then they're just stabbing him with needles while Rocky's out in the snow in that cabin just thugging it out. Sorry. I love that movie. If you haven't seen Rocky IV, stop this episode, go watch it, come back. The Soviets started using this in their athletes for international competitions, which led the Western nations, like the US, to follow suit because the US is like, oh, we have to beat the Soviets. By the 1960s, the use of anabolic steroids had become more widespread across various sports, particularly the Olympics, weightlifting, and bodybuilding. During this decade, there was very little public scrutiny. There was very little regulation over steroid use. People didn't really care, and the knowledge of their performance-enhancing effects spread rapidly among athletes and coaches. Awareness of steroid use in sports grew, and with it, the criticism of it. This is when people are kind of like, is this cheating? This conversation started happening. The first major sporting body to ban the use of performance-enhancing drugs, including steroids, was the International Olympic Committee, which added steroids to its list of banned substances in 1976. At this point, the long-term health implications would not become readily apparent, and research hadn't really been done on the adverse effects of testosterone enhancers and anabolic steroids, even though that would come later. Iconic bodybuilding figures like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Lou Ferrigno, as well as movies like the 1977 movie Pumping Iron, led to the increase of popularity in bodybuilding, but also more competitive pressure. And with that increase in competitive pressure, steroids became deeply entrenched in the culture of the sport. Also, if you're looking at people like Ronnie Coleman, that's not natural. Okay, to a point when you're competing against people who are that size, you either take performance-enhancing drugs or you're not going to win. You're not even going to place at this point. Bodybuilders sought to achieve unprecedented levels of muscle mass and low body fat percentages, which were difficult to attain without the use of performance-enhancing drugs, i.e. impossible to attain. So you can put on a lot of muscle mass through diet and exercise. Again, I'm an exercise physiologist. I've been working in fitness for a long time. Everyone has a genetic limit. Once you hit your genetic limit, you're going to have to take anabolic steroids, which is, it works the same system that your body naturally does to break down and build muscle, but you have to take it in order to compete at this level. Despite increasing regulatory scrutiny in other sports, bodybuilding remained relatively lax towards steroid use. Competitions rarely enforced drug tests, and the culture of the sport often implicitly encouraged their use due to the advantage they provided in muscle size and recovery. By the late 1980s, the adverse health effects of steroids, such as liver damage, cardiovascular issues, hormonal disruptions, were better understood, leading to a backlash against their use. And yes, gentlemen, steroid abuse does lead to testicular atrophy, which means baby balls, and hypogonadism, where your body loses the ability to produce enough testosterone. But I will say, I want to throw a little caveat in here. Again, working for the world bench press champion who taught me a lot about steroids and why he wasn't necessarily opposed to them. A lot of these health effects are from the abuse of steroids. Steroids are typically taken in a cycle, 8 to 12 weeks. You're supposed to cycle on, cycle off, cycle on, cycle off, take breaks from it. The problem happens is when people don't cycle on and off, and they continue to take them cycle without taking the time to stop doing it. And one of the things that's been interesting in various gym cultures, I totally understand someone being tempted to or taking performance-enhancing drugs when they are a professional athlete. And your money and your livelihood depend on your performance or your appearance in this case. I get that. I understand that, right? You got a family to feed. When Joe Schmo, who works in accounting, is taking, that doesn't make sense to me. Come on, Joe. Joe, really? Anyways, so average Joe taking steroids has always been confusing to me. In 1990, the United States passed the Anabolic Steroid Control Act, classifying steroids as a controlled substance alongside more strictly regulated drugs. This law aimed to curb non-medical use of steroids, impacting their use in sports, including bodybuilding. So bodybuilding really didn't have any regulations against steroid use until this law. Despite legal restrictions, the use of steroids and other performance-enhancing drugs continued clandestinely, and it still does. This is important to our story today. Steroid use is still hotly debated between professionals, but now you have a basic idea of the history and the culture around bodybuilding, which is super important in what we're about to talk about. As we get into this story, I want to be very clear that I will be openly and repetitively mocking these morons. I will call them names, and I will make fun of their manhood. Not because I believe that for all bodybuilders, but because these buffoons deserve it, and it's hilarious. Okay. Let's go. In 1987, John Meese opened the Sun Gym. Meese had started competitive bodybuilding at Texas A&M, where he earned an accounting degree. In 1962, while he was in the Air Force Station in England, he won the title of Mr. United Kingdom. The next year, he was accepted as a Mr. America contestant, but was denied leave. Mr. America was before Mr. Olympia was established. He was a passionate promoter of bodybuilding, and when bodybuilders came to compete in Miami, they came to Sun Gym. Meese was a successful accountant and bodybuilder, but not a successful gym owner. He repeatedly hired terrible managers who would later be arrested for drugs or theft. The clientele was problematic as well, being described as cops and bad guys. In Pete Collins' original Pain and Gain article in the Miami New Times, a police officer who was a member at the Sun Gym said he could meet my monthly quota of felony arrests in one night at Sun Gym by simply running background checks on the bodybuilders working out around me. By 1992, the gym was doing so poorly that Meese was considering closing its doors because it had become one massive money sink. Then enters Daniel Baby Balls Lugo. Lugo had come to the area from New York 4 years earlier with his wife, Lucretia Goodridge. He had a distinct New York accent and a Mike Tyson lisp, which just makes it so much better. Lugo had so many ideas to resurrect the gym and build a muscle-bound empire. He wanted to do a clothing line and vitamins and even have their own karate team. The Karate Kid came out in 1984, in case you're wondering where that idea came from. Lugo claimed he had a software that would render all the gym's current management systems completely obsolete. Meese was so overjoyed to save his gym, he was willing to overlook Lugo's shady past, which is a pattern Meese seemed to have. And here was that history. Lugo had served a 15-month sentence at Eglin Air Force Base Federal Correctional Institute for fraud and was ordered to pay back $70,000 to his victims. And he was no longer allowed to establish lines of credit or incur credit charges without permission from his probation officer. He had masqueraded as David Lowenstein, a financier for a fictitious Hong Kong bank that apparently had millions of dollars to loan to small business owners and entrepreneurs. He collected advance fee payments from applicants and then, shocker, got them no loans. He was arrested in 1990 at a Scandinavian health and racket club, and he did really stay fit when he was running a con. He pled guilty to fraud in 1991 in Miami with a plea deal. As a condition of that plea agreement, he had to admit similar criminal acts in Oklahoma. Daniel Fit Baby Bits Lugo was quoted as saying, "I hereby acknowledge my guilt, and I know that what I did was wrong. There's no substitute for hard work, and I am a hard worker. It will never happen again, and I have learned not to use my intelligence for wrong actions to justify the good end." And then he literally lies 2 minutes later to the same judge, saying he graduated from Furton with a computer science degree, which he never did. That's just not true. Fraud be damned. He was hired by Meese and was quickly promoted to gym manager and became a well-known centerpiece at Sun Gym. By the summer of 1994, the books for Sun Gym looked the best they had in years. Now let's meet meathead number 2. Lugo's best friend was Adrian Doorbal. He was a 10th grade dropout, a fry cook at a Fiesta Taco, and a personal trainer, and of course, obviously, a bodybuilder. Doorbal was in on Lugo's schemes, and Lugo in turn made his friend very, very rich. Shortly after Lugo was hired at Sun Gym, he and Doorbal established 10 fake medical companies using stolen identities to send fake medical bills to Medicare, and they were getting paid for services that had never been rendered. Doorbal made over $1 million from this scam. Lugo made even more. Enter Carl Weeks. After a dishonorable discharge from the Marines for threatening the life of a sergeant, they're gems. These guys are just absolute winners. Weeks had returned to Brooklyn, where he committed burglaries and armed robberies and became addicted to alcohol and crack. After serious seizure, he entered rehab, found Christianity, and he really wanted to stay clean, particularly since his girlfriend was pregnant with their third child. His girlfriend had a cousin in Miami, and it seemed like a good idea to move and start over. Her cousin, Stevenson Pierre, also worked at the gym and promised him a job there. But when Pierre took Weeks, a meager 140 pounds, to meet Lugo, Lugo had no openings, but hinted maybe he could open something up. You had to look the part to be at this gym. This was a judgy gym. So again, we're back to the Planet Fitness ads. You know, the lunk alarms and like the suit. This gym kind of fits that mold. Most gyms don't, but this one kind of sounds like it did. Lugo finally called Weeks in October of 1994 and asked him to come in for an offer. When Weeks arrived, Doorbal and Pierre were already there as well. Baby Balls Lugo asked them if they were interested in making $100K in a day. Some scumbag named Marc Schiller had stolen $100K from him and $200K from a gym member named Jorge Delgado, and they were going to get all that money and more back. Lugo said Schiller needed to be taken down, and they would take anything he owned, maybe even kill him. Weeks initially resisted. This is what he came to Miami to leave behind, but the promise of that much money and the charisma of Lugo, he agreed. They met a few days later with Delgado and decided on a plan to kidnap, and if they needed to, kill Schiller. Now, why Marc Schiller? In 1991, Jorge "These Nuts" Delgado quit his job as a car salesman, and when his wife cried to her boss, Schiller, about their desperate situation, Schiller gave Delgado a job at his MSS accounting services. The men grew to be best friends and business partners. Schiller helped Delgado grow tremendously financially. He knew the Schiller's family well, to the point where Schiller had given him the security code to his home. Delgado knew his home layout. He knew where his safe was. He knew where Schiller banked, the location and dollar amounts of his offshore accounts. Then Delgado met baby blue balls, Lugo, and quickly got pulled in. Delgado wanted to bring Lugo into his business with Schiller, and Schiller was not having it. Schiller did not trust him. He did not like him. He said, "It's him or it's me," and Delgado chose Lugo, even when Schiller warned him that Lugo would get him into deep trouble down the road. Now that the Sun Gym gang had a target, they ran over to, I shit you not, the Spy Shop on Biscayne Boulevard and purchased everything they would need to kidnap and extort an innocent man. They claimed to be security for a rock band and bought tasers, handcuffs, law enforcement-style walkie-talkies, anything you can think of. And before we dive into the ludicrous plans these buffoons had to kidnap Schiller, now is a great time for our mid-show sponsor break. This episode is brought to you by Intravenous Solutions, Nashville's premier IV therapy and wellness center. IV therapy can help you recover quicker from heavy workouts or illness, treat the symptoms of dehydration, and improve sleep and give you healthy, glowing skin. Being on stage several times a week, I can say that IV treatments keep me on my feet, and they are a lifesaver, both on stage and in the gym. Dr. Allen and his staff are so kind and so knowledgeable, they make sure that every appointment is welcoming and easy. They also offer vitamin shots, oxygen therapy, Botox, filler, weight management, and mobile services. With 4 locations in Nashville, Hendersonville, Franklin, and their brand new location on 2nd Avenue in Bankers Alley Hotel, it is easy to get high-quality care all week. So come party in Nashville, come see my band, and beat the hangover at Intravenous Solutions. Give the code Monty10 at checkout for a 10% discount on services. Okay, kiddos, pour a drink. Again, not if you're driving, but you get the idea. Plan number 1. The Sun Gym gang, 5 grown-ass bodybuilders, decided they were going to use Halloween as a cover and dress as ninjas and go trick-or-treating in Schiller's neighborhood. They'd knock on his door pretending to be little kids, and Schiller, expecting children, wouldn't be ready for grown men at his door, and they'd nab him. 2 problems they realized when they got to the neighborhood in their ninja costumes. They realized that 1, a lot of people are out on Halloween, and 2, most of those people are kids. 6 muscle-bound ninjas are going to stand out. So they bailed on this and went to the strip club instead. I hope they went in their ninja costumes. That would just bring me so much joy. Plan number 2, nab him on the Palmetto Expressway during rush hour. So they'd catch up to his car, pull him out of his car, and kidnap him. They tried to catch up to his car. He took an unexpected exit and they lost him, so they went to the strip club. Plan number 3. In Schiller's gated community, they would use a canal to gain access. Then Doorbal, Pierre, and Weeks, all in black with military camouflage makeup. Keep in mind, this is an urban setting, not the jungle. The army crawled across his lawn to storm the house. And because it was raining and they didn't want to get wet, they crawled under blankets. And I'm just imagining, like, Schiller has this, like, sweet 90-year-old lady that lives across the street with her husband, and they're having tea in the morning. And she's like, Bill, get over to this window. The grass is moving. I just can't. The plan was to army crawl across the lawn, storm the house, but a passing car scared them, so they ran back to the car. Morale was low, so guess what? Lugo took him to the strip club. After 6 failed attempts, the Sun Gym gang finally just kidnapped Schiller outside a deli he owned as he was walking to his car. He was grabbed by 3 men who stunned him with multiple tasers, each 120,000 volts. Schiller struggled and screamed as they ripped him from his car, beating him badly and threw him into their van. He was held at gunpoint and told to keep his eyes shut or die. He was shackled and pinned to the floor. His eyes were covered with duct tape. He was taken to one of Delgado's warehouses, and a voice in the front of the vehicle said into a cell phone, "The Eagle has landed." Which, again, is just like, it's so many bad spy movies and ninja movies. You can tell that this is like the action film and kung fu era, the way that they handled this. What's sad about the situation for Schiller is that he was a native-born Argentinian who worked in Colombia. He had experienced a kidnap and ransom of his boss in 1989 and had relocated with his family to Miami to avoid this exact danger. This is why he left Colombia. The gang immediately forced Schiller to make calls, reciting from rehearsed scripts. One call was to his wife, telling her to take the kids and flee to Colombia. She did not question it. She took those kids and ran. Very smart woman. This gave the gang, however, access to his empty house. Then multiple calls to business associates who he said he'd fallen in love with a young woman and he was liquidating his assets to run away with her. They forced him to sign multiple documents to drain his bank accounts. His blindfold was never removed. He never saw a single document he signed, but as he listened closely to his captors, he recognized Lugo's voice. Remember that Lugo has that deep New York accent and that lisp. And he knew that Delgado was the only person that could have given them so much information. The Sun Gym gang even gave themselves nicknames. It's adorable. Lugo was Batman, Adrian Doorbal was Robin, Carl Weeks was referred to as Sparrow, which kind of feels like a jab, and Stevenson Pierre was referred to as Napoleon because he was not super gung-ho through all of this, and they kind of judged him for that. I will say that Weeks and Pierre were the only ones who tried to treat Schiller with some kindness. They tried to sneak him food and water, and even helped with his painful bindings. They actually used a maxi pad across the bridge of his nose because the duct tape was making him bleed. So you guys remember that, like, Lugo has a wife this whole time, right? So his wife, pregnant with their second child, starts to get suspicious of Daniel Limp Lucky Lugo, and she's wondering where he is all the time. She begins to pester Lugo, and he eventually takes her to the warehouse to prove to her that he isn't cheating. He shows her his prisoner. He shows her Schiller tied to a chair with his eyes duct taped and says, "This is what I'm doing." And she's like, okay, and doesn't say anything. Doesn't go to the cops, doesn't do shit. She's like, okay, he's not seeing another woman, I'm fine now. Which is wild. The characters in this story are just very low on the IQ scale. It took weeks to convert Schiller's assets and foreign accounts to drain them completely into his bank in Miami. It wasn't until December 10th that the last of the money was complete. Now they needed to get rid of Schiller. They decided to get Schiller raging drunk and send him out in his car to a fatal car crash. They got Schiller completely shit-faced with alcohol and sleeping pills for 3 days straight before pushing him into his 4Runner. They picked a crash site, strapped Schiller to the driver's seat, and Lugo stomped on the gas, guiding the car to a utility pole, and Lugo jumped out just before the collision. When they ran up to the wreckage, Schiller was still alive. So they soaked the car, lit it on fire. Schiller was able to get out of the car, put himself out, and was still alive, so they ran over him twice with their vehicles and left him for dead. This man is the OG of this entire story. Schiller was still alive. He was rescued and taken to Jackson Memorial Hospital, and after a month of recovery, was finally able to call private investigator Ed Dubois, who he begged for help. Ed agreed but warned him to get out of the hospital because the men who did this may try to finish the job. And he was right. Lugo and the boys, when they found out Schiller was still alive, did try to get into the hospital and murder him. As soon as he was able, he was transferred to a hospital in New York and then stayed with his sister in Long Island to recover. When the Sun Gym gang hadn't heard from Schiller by January, they decided it was safe to move into Schiller's house, living in the house of the man they had already profited $2.1 million from. Lugo introduced himself to neighbors as Tom and that he and his buddies were members of U.S. security forces and that Schiller had been deported and his assets seized. After taking care of domestic duties, they went back to the strip club. And then Lugo, the man with a wife with a second child on the way, started dating 25-year-old stripper Sabina Petrusko. He convinced her that he was in the music business and he wanted to use her in a music video. Of course he did. Within a week, they were dating. He got her a one-bedroom apartment in Miami Lakes and convinced her that he would take care of her. They even began living together. Conveniently, this was just a few miles away, so he could, rush home and be with his pregnant wife. Sabina, like Lugo's wife, started to question his odd hours and his trips. It seemed kind of weird for a music video director. She demanded an explanation, and Lugo said, "Look," this is a quote, "Look, if you're ever going to understand me, if this relationship is ever going to be real, you've got to understand my work. I'm with the Central Intelligence Agency." It's too much. But Sabina is a native Romanian who grew up on a steady diet of American movies, believes him, you poor, sweet, brainless little baby bird. And she was so happy to help her newfound secret agent. He even gave her a special beeper code when he was trying to reach her. The beeper code was 007. I wrote these notes and I'm going to throw something across the room. While the Sun Gym gang was pursuing stripper girlfriends, Marc Schiller was trying to put his financial life in order and create a paper trail. He knew Lugo and Delgado were in on it, and he was finally seeing the financial chaos the gang had left him in. He sent all the information he could find to the office of Ed Dubois. When Dubois followed the names in the paper trail, they all led to one notary, John Meese, the owner of the Sun Gym. He's an accountant, remember, he's also a notary. Ed was personal friends with John Meese. In fact, he'd known him and his family for 30 years through the Miami Shores Country Club and the Kiwanis Club. In fact, Meese had even used his detective agency before. He needed to find out if Meese was a con or someone who was conned and scheduled a meeting on February 2nd, 1995. Meese said he didn't know Schiller, but he did know Lugo and Delgado. Dubois then handed him the documents that he had notarized, and he said he did notarize this document with Lugo and Delgado and a Latin man they brought in with a passport for identification. It was all above board. But then there was the signature of Diana Schiller. Meese was adamant that a woman had never been present and a woman hadn't signed a document with him. He agreed to organize a meeting with Lugo and Delgado to sort things out. After a second meeting where Lugo and Delgado didn't show up, Meese allowed Dubois and his bodyguard Siebert to go through the gym files in his office, which was also Lugo's office. This was a big mistake on his part. Siebert, who was former law enforcement, decides to dig through the trash, and he actually found the plans from the Sun Gym gang for the Schiller abduction. It included evidence that the gang had burned through almost $200,000 in a month, which had to be from Schiller's fortune. The gym was not pulling those kind of numbers. Soon they traced the money to Weeks, paying off Lugo's court-ordered restitution. They found money laundering used to shuffle funds from Schiller's offshore accounts to Sun Fitness consultants to central banks. They connected every gang member, the spy shop, and the shell companies that were used to funnel Schiller's money through. They literally filled briefcases with incriminating documents, and now they knew Meese was also involved. There was no way that he notarized all of these documents and didn't know that something was wrong. Dubois confronted Delgado and demanded they pay back $1.26 million to Schiller. Lugo bought Sabina an engagement ring for Valentine's Day, but a problem was looming on the horizon. Private investigator Ed Dubois. Lugo began to obsess over Schiller and the detective, worried they'd ruin his new life with his new girlfriend, and worried his wife would eventually find out. Schiller was not pleased with the payback agreement, feeling that it was just an attempt to stall long enough to find him and finish the job. He honestly wasn't too far from the truth. They had no intention of paying the money back, but they did use the extra time to completely empty Schiller's house of everything of value. They even took his family's photo albums. Schiller's entire life was gone. Dubois began to notice particularly bulky strangers hanging around his house, and the phone company informed him someone was trying to access his calls to South America. Finally, Dubois called Metro-Dade homicide captain Al Harper, a 27-year veteran of the police department and a mutual acquaintance. After Harper heard the horrific story, he called Metro's Elite Strategic Investigations Division. This is the division that handled all major investigations involving fraud, trafficking, contract killings, and criminal conspiracies. SID agreed to review the case. After Dubois contacted SID detective Kevin Long, the private investigator didn't give him a lot of details, but first wanted to establish Schiller as a credible victim. Would SID be willing to prepare a polygraph for his client? As a polygraph examiner since 1974, Dubois knew that this would be an effective way to show that Schiller's weird, crazy story was actually true. Sure, Long said, and then he sat back to listen as Dubois went over the case and what he knew of the suspects. They both agreed that if Schiller would come back to Miami, he would see him take the complaint and they would issue a polygraph test. They set up a 3-day interview window from April 18th to April 20th of 1995. Here's Salem. Schiller flew from Colombia to Miami despite being afraid he'd be killed and met Dubois in person for the first time and agreed to secretly meet with SID detectives. Unfortunately, they were met with bad news. SID did not schedule the polygraph after all and decided to refer the case to the Robbery Bureau. SID did not take Schiller seriously, so much to the point that when they went to the police station to meet with the Robbery Bureau, a detective clapped quietly as they walked by. And when Dubois asked about this, the woman leading them said, "Well, don't tell anyone I told you. But SID called over here this morning and said we should expect an Academy Award-winning performance and story from Mr. Schiller today." I feel so bad for Marc Schiller in that moment. Like, your entire life has been stripped from you. You were tortured for a month. And now people are acting like you're some crazy pants, like just wanting attention. Schiller had already delayed his return home to take this polygraph he was promised, but the police said they wouldn't do the test until the following Tuesday, and if he wasn't there, clearly he was lying and they wouldn't take the case. Schiller had booked and rescheduled his travel on his own dime, and he could not physically afford to reschedule again. Also, I'm sure he was extremely angry, and he fucking went home. The police wondered why he had waited so long to come to the police. The story just seemed so crazy, and because of his ties to Colombia, they racially profiled him with the belief that there had to be cocaine money gone wrong involved. Despite having massive doubts about Schiller's story, Detective Iris Deegan did decide that she was going to at least look into everything. She decided to go to Schiller's home in Old Cutler Grove, and the house appeared abandoned. She interviewed Schiller's neighbors. They identified Lugo from a lineup. And they told her, yeah, he said he worked for the government. They had picked up UPS deliveries for him, things that were addressed to Marc Schiller they picked up for him. And yeah, they said that Schiller and his family had disappeared right before Thanksgiving. Everything was lining up with what Schiller had claimed. By May 4th, Deegan was finally convinced something was really, really wrong. She filed her third and what would be her final report, case number 195623-R, noting that she subpoenaed Schiller's bank and credit card accounts, as well as anything from the UPS or delivery services. However, she never interviewed any suspects, and she kind of let things lay from there. Dubois even went so far as to approach the FBI, who also looked at this story and said, "This looks like a movie. No, we're not taking this case. This can't possibly be real. It's preposterous." One of Dubois' primary concerns was that if the Sun Gym Gang got away with it this time, they would do it a second time, and he was right. So you remember how the Sun Gym Gang, their thing is to go to strip clubs. If they fail a kidnapping attempt, they go to the strip club. If they are successful at a kidnapping attempt, they go to the strip club. Lugo has his stripper girlfriend named Sabina, and also Adrian Doorbal was dating a beautiful stripper named Beatrice Weiland, who was a native Hungarian. While at her apartment flipping through a photo album, he sees a beautiful 1991 Lamborghini Diablo and asks who it belongs to. She points to a different photo and identifies a man named Frank Griga, who was an ex of hers and had become incredibly wealthy through the phone sex business. She spoke of him fondly and said that he was the most generous man she'd ever met. Frank Griga was known by many Hungarians in Miami as the Alexander Graham Bell of phone sex. The business earned Griga and his partners a fortune. In 1994 alone, they took in $3 million. Griga was actually dating a beautiful woman named Krisztina Furton, who Beatrice had introduced him to. The two had quickly fallen in love and became inseparable. Krisztina was also from a Hungarian family, was 21 years old, and came to Miami in 1993. She was penniless and didn't really speak a lot of English. She arrived with the promise of a job as a dancer, which was honestly a typical stepping stone for really pretty foreign girls who were just trying to get a green card. Doorbal was eventually able to convince Beatrice to reach out to her ex-husband to arrange a meeting for Danny Lugo Doorbal to meet Griga. With their new target in place, Lugo decided to recruit Sabina. He said to her, "You always ask if you can help me. Well, I need your help now." So he told Sabina that this would be an undercover operation for the United States of America, that the FBI wanted him to capture someone named Frank Griga, a Golden Beach businessman who used women, and especially Hungarian women, for sex. And besides that, he was circumventing U.S. tax laws. Sabina was excited for this assignment. She wanted to display her patriotism, and she is not smart. Gorgeous, but not smart. Sabina buys this hook, line, and sinker. He fills her in on the new job where they plan to snatch Griga and his girlfriend from Griga's mansion and hold them hostage. She questioned why they would take the girlfriend. The FBI doesn't need her. And Lugo says she's the girlfriend and she'll know about it. We can't just let her go. She would talk, but we won't hurt her. Sabina doesn't even catch on that why is the FBI now the boss instead of the CIA? But before they could do this kidnapping, they needed two things. They needed to establish a relationship with Griga, and they needed to know the layout of the house. So Lugo and Doorbal abandoned their gym clothes and put on well-tailored suits looking like a pair of Wall Street aficionados. When they were able to meet with Griga, they decided they were offering a lucrative investment opportunity through Interling International Incorporated, which was actually a telecommunications company that was expanding into India. They had color brochures and pie charts and text indicating that there would be serious growth and that the only real competition was AT&T. They were seeking only serious investors, and Griga would have to chip in between $500,000 and $1 million to even get his foot in the door. Griga was excited and interested. He said he might even want to invest more than $1 million, especially if they could reach into South Asia. And as a bonus, Krisztina gave Lugo and Doorbal a guided tour of the mansion. Now they knew the exact layout of everywhere they needed to be. Once he got back home, Lugo told Sabina that the abduction of these two would go down tomorrow. And that evening, she watched in her living room as he and Doorbal pack their FBI equipment. It's the FBI now, it's not the CIA. Guns, handcuffs, ropes, syringes, and rompum, which is a tranquilizer used to sedate horses and other very large animals. The next day, as they drove to the mansion, they decided to jam out to the Eagles' Life in the Fast Lane, which had now become the soundtrack for their mission. Sabina sat in the back seat and watched the men exchange glances and grins. She'd never seen them look so happy. When they get to the house, she saw Lugo, who was carrying a laptop in one hand, stick a gun into the waistband of his nylon sports pants with the other. And as they approached the front door, Lugo clumsily knocked over a garbage can, and Krisztina smiled and came to the door. Sabina waited in the car nervously for 5, 10, 15 minutes, and she imagined that something was unfolding inside the house. They had decided that Doorbal would take care of the woman while Lugo handled Griga himself. But the garage door, like they had planned, never opened. Instead, Lugo and Doorbal came out empty-handed. Doorbal starts yelling, "We should have done it! We should have done it!" "No," argued Lugo, "the timing wasn't right," but he had a new plan. There was going to be no abduction of Krisztina and Griga today. They could meet in Miami Lakes at Shula's Steakhouse and talk over the Interling deal. Griga accepted the invitation, but with a little bit of hesitation. Things had started to seem a little bit strange. When Lugo and Doorbal had been at his house, they had gifted him a computer even before business talks had really been started, much less finalized. He did eventually decide to meet with the two businessmen at Shula's, but something just seemed a little bit off. That evening, before dinner, Sabina was sitting on Doorbal's couch, and Lugo explained her role to her. When the foursome returned from the steakhouse, they were going to come back to the apartment for drinks. Sabina was to pretend that she was Lugo's Russian wife. She was to befriend and distract Krisztina, make her feel good, as the men lured Griga into another room to finally take him down. Sabina waited for hours. She was so excited to be part of this, but when Lugo showed up, he was distressed and alone. Another mission failed and aborted. Over the next few days, Griga starts looking into Interling International Corporate Information Package. He ran the proposal by a stockbroker friend. Lugo and Doorbal appeared well off. The investment looks solid, and they seemed to have an excellent grasp of the stock market and finances. Griga decided that he would meet once again with the muscle-bound maniacs. Prior to Krisztina and Griga leaving for their third meeting with Lugo and Doorbal, who had stopped by and met them at the house before going to dinner, their neighbor, Judy Bertuz, was out walking her dog. She'd seen a lot of cars stop by with some purchases that Griga had made earlier that day, and she saw for the first time Lugo and Doorbal, guys with phone deals in South Asia, Griga had said. She didn't recognize them, but made a mental note of it and waved them off as they went to dinner. Unfortunately for Griga and Krisztina, they would not be as fortunate as Schiller. They had decided to go to dinner at Shula's again, but it was closed upon their arrival, so they decided to go to Doorbal's Main Street townhouse apartment, which was above Richie Swimwear, instead. Lugo and Krisztina were watching television on Schiller's 50-inch TV, and Doorbal and Griga walked into the other room to talk business. Soon, though, there started to be noises that the speakers couldn't muffle. It was clear that there was a fierce argument underway. Then there was crashing noises. Lugo and Krisztina rushed in and found the two men viciously fighting each other. Blood was running down Griga's head where he'd been hit above the ear with a hard, blunt object. As Krisztina looked around the room, blood was splattered on the computer screen, the sliding glass doors, there was blood on the walls, and it was very clearly all Griga's. She watched in horror as Doorbal grabbed her lover and proceeded to strangle him. When she screamed, Lugo clamped his hand over her mouth and tackled her. She was handcuffed and bound quickly, and then they injected her with rompin. Within moments, she was unconscious. They pulled a ninja hood down over her head. Do they just carry these costumes with them? For good measure, they gave Griga a hefty dose of rompin as well. They finally had their targets. Finally! After taking a quick breath and surveying the scene, they decided to check on their prize that they would take to the warehouse and, just like Schiller, torture until he handed over all of his money. Unfortunately, to their great disappointment, they'd overdone it. Griga was already dead, and they hadn't gotten a single penny out of him. They'd managed to take everything from Schiller but couldn't kill him, and with Griga, they were able to kill him before they could get a penny from him. But the consolation prize was that they had Krisztina, and she was still alive. Eventually, of course, they would kill her as well, but maybe she could provide information about the house, the front door keypad numbers, for instance. They put Griga in the bathtub for the moment so that his blood would drain out cleanly. And 2 miles away, Jorge Delgado waited at home for a phone call. He was supposed to be the one that transported the couple to Lugo's warehouse for the preliminary round of torture and extortion, just like they had done with Marc Schiller. But the phone never rang, so he went to bed. When Delgado's phone did finally ring the next morning, it was Lugo, but they had bad news. Griga was already dead. They had his girlfriend. She was unconscious. She was shot full of horse tranquilizer to keep her quiet, so things could be worse. At least they had someone. At least they could get something. Delgado raced to the townhouse to try to help with the damage control. They also had to get rid of Griga's body. The temperature was the first thing that he noticed. They had turned the AC all the way up, and the place was as cold as a meat locker. From the entry, he watched as Doorbal, who was really bundled up like he was walking in the winter in Russia, came downstairs with an unconscious woman slung over his shoulder. They were able to get the front door code from a barely lucid Krisztina, who at this point had been injected with multiple doses of horse tranquilizer and was barely coherent and could barely speak English to begin with, much less under the influence of so much drugs. Lugo decides that the best thing to do is to use the security code numbers to see if he can access the safe, financial records, and maybe get into a computer. That way, the mission may not be a total failure. He races to the house and he enters the numbers. It's wrong. It doesn't open. He looks at his paper and he tries again. Krisztina had given them the wrong numbers. Lugo races to his car and calls Doorbal. Wake her up, he ordered. Do anything. Get the damn door code. Doorbal races to check on Krisztina and then comes back to the phone and says, and I quote, "Oh man, Danny, the bitch is cold." The words chilled Sabina because she heard them over the speakerphone. Lugo was furious. It didn't matter now, though. The most important thing was getting rid of the bodies. So on Friday morning, May 26, Jorge Delgado went to a U-Haul and rented a white Ford van. Lugo and Doorbal, meanwhile, went to a Home Depot. They filled 2 lumber carts with cleaning buckets, gallon containers of Ready Road repair tar, floor fans, and a 18-inch gas-powered chainsaw. Ironically, the total, which they put on Doorbal's American Express card, came out to $666 with tax. What they decided to do is that they were going to use the chainsaw to dismember the bodies, cut them into little bits, and then drop them off at multiple locations so that they could not be identified. They stripped and cleaned the bodies, laid them down on tarps to begin their work. And the fans were blowing, the warehouse television was on, everything was set. But not one of them could figure out how to put together the chainsaw. They took turns going over the instruction manual. They were finally able to assemble it, but when they cranked it, it seized and stalled because they had forgotten to get motor oil. Delgado went out to get some as well as snacks, but even when he returned, the chainsaw still wouldn't start. It was seized completely. So they decided to put it back in the box and take it back to Home Depot and exchange it for an electric chainsaw. Meanwhile, back at Griga's house, Esther Toth, the maid, arrived for work on Friday morning and stopped in her tracks. Frank Griga's dog, Chopin, had destroyed the place. It was very clear that they had never gotten home. She walked down the street to ask Judy Bartuz, the one who had seen them the night before, to accompany her in the house. They put in the keypad numbers, opened the door, and Bartuz's heart sank. The place was completely torn apart. There was only one island of undisturbed calm, the living room coffee table that rested 2 glasses, and she remembered Frank's new business partners who had been sipping on those glasses the night before. They knew something was wrong, and they knew that Griga and Krisztina had never made it home. And Judy is such a gem here. So she realizes, okay, so they probably haven't come home. They would not leave their dog unsupervised. But she also remembered that Frank had said they might fly to Freeport, which means they would have left the day before. Judy called Griga's Bahamas condo. There was no answer, so she looks in the garage. The Lamborghini's gone. She looks in the bedroom and finds 2 round-trip airline tickets. So she knows they didn't leave. They don't have their documents. They don't have their tickets. They did not come home. They did not board a plane. And that's when she looks over at the maid and she says, listen, feed the dog and I want you to go home. She looks at the glasses on the coffee table and says, do not touch those. She races back to her own house and tells her husband the disturbing news. While he began calling their network of Hungarian friends, she drove to Miami Lakes to look at Shula's steakhouse. That's where she knew that they were going to dinner because she had spoke to them briefly before they left the house. She didn't spot the Lamborghini, but a parking attendant down the block remembered it. Like, this woman is doing recon all by herself for her neighbors, and I love it. She's like not the first, I guess we could put Ed Dubois in there. She's the first brain we've seen this entire episode. Shula's steakhouse is really close to the main street where Doorbal's apartment was, so she slowly drives down the street and she sees a gold Mercedes that she recognized from being in Griga's driveway on Wednesday night. She writes down the license plate number and heads back home. Her and her husband are now in a panic. Their friends have been missing clearly for more than a day. They call the Golden Beach Police Department and inform them about what they know so far. Within minutes, Chief Stanley Kramer met with them in Griga's driveway. Judy punched in the numbers to the front door keypad, took him inside, and explained the circumstances of their friend's disappearance, as well as the strange men that she had never seen before that night. Lugo, during this time, returns to the Home Depot to exchange the chainsaws. The gang sets to work to continue to dismember the bodies with the electric chainsaw, but it unfortunately becomes tangled in Kristina's hair and also gets jammed and useless. So then they decide they're going to do it the old-fashioned way and dismember the bodies with a hatchet. After dismembering and separating the bodies into gallon drums, they realize they've made another critical error. They forgot about identification. There's fingerprints, there's toe prints, there's teeth, and their faces. So they decide to bring the skulls back out, remove all the teeth and facial identifications, and then use the feet and the hands as a sort of makeshift macabre barbecue to cook down any possibility of fingerprints being taken. After disposing of Griga's very noticeable 1991 yellow Lamborghini Diablo and disposing of the bodies in their drums into the murky waters near Miami, the Sun Gym gang thought that, well, it didn't go as planned, but there was no evidence and they couldn't be prosecuted for the crime. Unfortunately for the Sun Gym gang, things were beginning to unravel. Due to the unusual circumstances of Frank and Kristina's disappearance, plus the information from neighbors, the police were informed within 24 hours of their disappearance. In fact, Frank's sister Susanna had been calling from Hungary, threatening people to find out what had happened to her brother. The mutual acquaintance who had introduced Griga to Lugo and Doorbal had also told the police everything. So had Doorbal's ex-girlfriend, Beatrice. Another close friend of Griga's had even seen them as they drove to dispose of his Lamborghini. He would recognize that car anywhere and followed them to be able to identify them as they dropped off the car. 8 days later, Ed Dubois gets a phone call from Captain Al Harper, that 27-year Metro-Dade police veteran who had tried to help him with the Marc Schiller case. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. There were several suspects that were under investigation for the abduction of a wealthy Hungarian businessman and his girlfriend. All of the suspects worked at the gym. Harper had called Dubois to ask if it could be the same men. Dubois ran back down the facts of Schiller's case, and Harper felt a shot of adrenaline. It had to be the same men. Dubois felt vindicated, and he could finally prove that Schiller had told the truth and bring his case back to life. After revisiting the details of the Schiller case, homicide detectives now had a lead, and at this point, Griga and Krisztina were assumed dead. Lugo and Doorbal began to unravel. They even showed up to Beatrice's work and threatened her in person. She, in turn, informed another mutual friend who had spoken to police to watch his back. Schiller was flown back in triumph from Colombia, and this time nobody thought that he was lying, and nobody asked him for a polygraph. He talked about his former partner, Delgado, to whom he had been forced to grant power of attorney. He also identified Daniel Lugo, whose voice he recognized as someone who held him in the warehouse, and he gave them the names of the people who had taken over his house and took control of his bank. He even gave them the name of John Meese, who had facilitated the money transferred. On June 3rd at 7 o'clock in the morning, 75 officers, including homicide squad, SWAT teams, and hostage negotiators, gathered next to the Miami Lakes police station. They were ready to serve search warrants at the homes of Daniel Lugo and Delgado and Adrian Doorbal. John Meese was also on the list. All of the house warrants were served at 8:30. The Delgados at first laughed at the accusation. How could Delgado do such a thing to his former business partner? But when he was interviewed, he said that he did hire Lugo to collect money Schiller owed him, and Lugo got carried away. But when his lawyer showed up, Delgo refused to speak any further. During the crime spree, Doorbal had gotten married in a whirlwind romance to Cindy Eldridge. Unfortunately, the honeymoon would be short-lived. Cindy had begun to get suspicious about Doorbal's involvement in the missing Hungarian couple. She woke that Saturday to end their honeymoon, but it came to a halt anyway because she was drinking her morning coffee when there was a pounding on the door and a throng of police officers. They moved inside and read her the warrant and waited at the foot of the stairs for her husband when he was arrested. As he was taken downtown, they searched the townhouse for evidence and took with them furniture, jewelry, electronics, computer equipment, and even magazines that had come from Schiller's house. He had even been stupid enough to keep a photo album of Marc and Diana Schiller. Lugo had already ran to the Bahamas but was captured by a multi-agency task force and flown back into Miami. When he saw the squad cars, police lights, and an array of armed officers, he asked, "Is this all for me?" The detective seated beside him said, "You're in a little bit of trouble in Miami." Sabina broke down an interrogation and offered investigators all the information about Lugo they could stomach. She included his lies about working for the Central Intelligence Agency and her knowledge of the crimes and the attempted crimes. She was simply faced with one charge, which was the theft of a motor vehicle. Police also struck deals with Weeks and Pierre, who told them everything they knew about the Schiller abduction and were given a plea deal of 10-year sentences. But for the heavy hitters, on March 27, 1996, the grand jury returned a 46-count indictment against the leaders of the Sun Gym Gang for conspiracy to commit the murders of Frank Griga and Krisztina Burton, and for kidnapping, extortion, and attempted murder of Schiller. The indictment also included RICO charges. Delgado was the first of the ringleaders of the Sun Gym Gang to crack and gave a complete confession. He was given a 15-year sentence for Schiller's crimes that would run concurrently with a 5-year sentence for his role in the Griga case, especially since he was not present during their abduction and their murder. It was really a sweetheart deal. The jury for the trial of Lugo, Doorbal, and Meese began in January of 1998. The trial began on February 24th and would become Dade County's most expensive criminal trial in history. It featured more than 1,200 pieces of evidence and 98 witnesses, including Marc Schiller, who had flown multiple times to Miami to prepare the prosecution. The prosecution argument alone lasted for 10 weeks, and when they rested, Lugo's attorney chose not to present a defense, which is great. Like, they didn't even try. John Meese's public defender only called one witness. Lugo was convicted of 2 murders as well as 16 other charges that included racketeering, kidnapping, extortion, theft, attempted murder, armed robbery, money laundering, and forgery. Doorbal was also found guilty of the 2 murders with 13 additional charges, and on June 1st, Doorbal's jury deliberated just 14 minutes before recommending the death penalty. Lugo's panel voted for the death penalty as well, and it only took them 18 minutes to make that decision. Meese was convicted on 39 felony counts, including 2 first-degree murder charges, attempted murder, racketeering, and multiple counts of money laundering. The prosecution had offered him a plea bargain for 9 years in state prison that he had rejected, and he ended up being sentenced to 56 years in prison. The death penalty hearing took place on July 8th, and in an act of poetic justice, Schiller was allowed to speak to his captors who were now shackled and handcuffed. He spoke fluidly and with agonizing detail of the torture that they had put him through in his month of captivity. He spoke of how his family suffered, the scars he still struggles with, the nightmare he still had, how his wife, whose failing health had dropped her to a mere 84 pounds. He looked at his captors and told them they never deserved to live in society again. Schiller walked out of the courtroom victorious for a literal minute. Men started shouting, ordering him to stop for the second time in his life. Schiller was grabbed and taken away. He was arrested by FBI agents on charges of orchestrating fraudulent Medicare billing scheme that had netted him $14 million. He himself was now facing 25 years in prison, 10 years more than Delgado received for his kidnapping and torture. While Schiller had been helping Miami police catch the Sun Gym gang, the district attorney was helping the FBI capture a federal target. On July 17, 1998, Judge Ferrer sentenced Lugo and Doorbal to 2 death sentences for the murders of Frank Griga and Krisztina Furton, and consecutive sentences for all the other crimes that they had been convicted of. This judge later provided favorable testimony for Schiller's sentencing hearing, who had pleaded guilty to 1 federal count of false Medicare billing. Because of this testimony, Marc Schiller was only sentenced to 46 months in prison, which is the most lenient sentence allowed under federal guidelines. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the murder, kidnapping, extortion, ninja-wearing story of the Sun Gym gang. I told you it was crazy. It's absolutely nuts. I can't believe all that happened. And the plot twist at the end where Schiller gets arrested? Too much. Too much. Let's move to the travel portion of this episode. All right, and before I get into this, I apologize. There's a little bit of some weirdness in the middle of the episode. I was having some recording issues, which I now realize was because a thunderstorm rolled in. So if you hear some booming and some noise, it's because there's a storm. Let's talk about Miami. So the recommendations that I'm going to give, I am not a club party person. I never have been. I never had a phase. Seeing a club in a movie gives me anxiety. And people are like, well, you're a performer. You're in bars all the time. Yes, I'm on stage away from the crushing crowds. So I'm going to give some recommendations that are not necessarily like North Beach, South Beach. If you've never been to Miami, by all means, go to those areas. The beaches are beautiful. If you like clubs, do that. There's lots of nightclubs. There's lots of music. Do the jet skis. Do the rent the fancy cars and drive down. Do all of that stuff. I've done it. It's not really my speed. So I'm going to give a little bit different recommendations. The one thing I will say, if you've never been to Miami, definitely go to the Fontainebleau. Even if you just go to the bar for a cocktail, it's a beautiful hotel, beautiful bar. The club is crazy. So if that's your vibe, get dressed, spiffed up, get in line, go check it out. Again, not really my thing. Let's talk food though. So it's people that know me know that I am super passionate about Barcelona is my favorite city in the entire world. And I just in general love Spanish culture. So Spanish music, Spanish food, all of this is music to my ears. But the first restaurant I'm going to recommend is actually Italian-inspired dishes. It's called Boade, and it's near Little Haiti. And it's a very affordable, budget-friendly restaurant. It's just really interesting takes on classics. The atmosphere was really friendly. It wasn't overwhelming. And again, it's off the beaten path. Most of my recommendations are going to be off of South Beach, North Beach. For your fancy dinner, because I love a fancy restaurant, and sometimes you just got to do it. The Surf Club, which is in the Four Seasons Surf Club. Now, this is one of those meals where go in expecting to spend money. Date nights, honeymoon, anniversary, but the carved beef Wellington is worth the sacrifice. I would sacrifice a lot to eat that again. And then the last one, this one surprised me. So when I go to travel, I do a lot of research on Reddit and I like to try to ask locals, and I love Cuban food. I love Cuban food. So I was searching Reddit. I was reaching out to people that I know lived in Miami for a long time. This restaurant came up the most. I had never heard of it. It's between Little Gables and Little Havana, as it should be, and it's called Versailles. Again, super affordable, kind of mid-range restaurant. There's these beautiful chandeliers, and to me, it kind of felt like I transported to Cuba, and it was so comfortable, and the food was so unbelievably delicious. I walked out feeling like a little like pig in a blanket. Probably the best Cuban food I've ever had, which again, not surprising. would absolutely recommend. So if you're going to Miami and you've been there before, or you're like me and like the club thing is not really your jam, dig into actual Miami. Go across the water, get into the city. Bars, same thing. So I lived in New York for a long time, and I love a wine bar. I also, again, I just don't like being in super crowded club-like environments. I do not know how to pronounce this. I practiced it so many times. It's Lagnappe. It's Lagniappe, and I still can't pronounce it. It's a beautiful wine bar, and they let you like pick and choose your own charcuterie, which I am like, again, there are a lot of things I will sacrifice for a good charcuterie board. It was amazing, and it was so laid back, and it was a place, this was the first place that I went to, and I just felt like I could actually relax because I've been traveling this whole month, freaking out, and like, I gotta get back to Nashville, and I gotta do this, and I gotta get these things ready, and all these choices I'm making in my life. This was amazing. Dante's Hi-Fi is my second one. You have to have a reservation. So this is like B and GC in Denver. You have to have a reservation. Make sure you get there on time. This was such a surprise. Like several people had told me, you got to go here. It's really relaxed. You can have a conversation. The cocktails are great. What I didn't know is that they spin vinyl. So they were playing funk and soul, and like, it was some of the best music I've ever heard in a bar setting, and it was all vinyls. And they have this huge record collection that was I was just caught off guard by that. I didn't expect that. It was amazing. But my favorite bar, the one that won for me, it's in Little Havana. I got to explore Little Havana a lot more this trip than I have in the past. There's a bar called Ball and Chain. It's originally a nightclub that ran from the 30s to the 50s, and it's now a live music bar. And there's live jazz and flamenco dancers, and I think they do dance lessons like certain nights of the week. I think it felt like I was in Cuba or South America somewhere, and it was just, I felt like I was in another country. And I love Spain. Spain is my absolute favorite, and I haven't been to Spain since 2019. And it just made me feel like I got to take that trip again finally. It was just, that place was such a win. Such a win. You absolutely have to go to Ball and Chain in Little Havana. And then must-dos. Again, if you've never been, by all means, do the jet skis and obviously go to the beach. I love the beach. Do the South Beach, North Beach thing, if that's your vibe. Do the clubs. There's so many of them. Like South Beach especially is such a party area. Again, not my thing, but if you've never been and that's your thing, go for it. What I will say, my must-dos in Miami, so much Latin music of any, like, different genres. Find bars, find local bands. They're everywhere, especially in Little Havana. I was like listening to Latin jazz, and then there was like a Latin reggae, and I was just walking around. It was incredible. Absolutely go see local music. You don't have to understand it. You can understand it with your heart. It's fine. This trip, and I had meant to go the last time I was in Miami, but I didn't get to go until this trip, the Cloisters, which are in North Miami Beach. So it's the remains of an ancient Spanish monastery, and they're the oldest European buildings in the Western Hemisphere because Florida was originally colonized by Spain. Really breathtaking and kind of surprising. Like I said, I didn't get to go my last trip, but I got to go this trip, and I'm a history buff. 10 out of 10 would recommend. And this one was a little bit of a gamble, and this won't be for everyone, and that's okay. The World Erotic Art Museum, and it is exactly what it sounds like. But this is like erotic art starting all the way at antiquity to the modern time. And not only was so much of the art really beautiful, and some of it was a little disturbing, but it was really interesting to see all these very, very old pieces of erotic art. It was just kind of a cool thread through humanity. I went on a whim and I was like, this might be the worst thing I've ever done. But it was actually really, really incredible. So again, if you like art and you're comfortable outside of the box, go to the World Erotic Art Museum. And my other little surprise, I had a list of things I was going to include. I did a bunch of great things. I just kind of ran out of time. I decided I don't do a lot of comedy. Even in Nashville, I don't go to Zanies very often. It's just, I kind of forget about it. And I had been talking to a couple locals, and they were like, oh, have you seen any improv? They were big comedy fans. I was like, I haven't done any improv on this whole podcasting adventure. So I ended up going to Miami Improv, and it was incredible. My face hurt. It was so much fun. Again, it was just so relaxed. And it was a surprise, because when I go to Miami, I'm thinking Latin food, Latin music, do this. And I just didn't think about improv. Would absolutely recommend. It was a great experience, top to bottom. And there was another place that they told me about. I didn't get a chance to go see. It's called Denia Beach Improv. Is also supposed to be very, very good. And again, with these huge cities, there's so much to do, and there's so many things you can plan. But just what I tell people, and what I've been telling people as I go on these travels, are like, well, how do you think of what to recommend? I always recommend, like, when you're at a restaurant or a bar, order something that you would normally never get. Something that's like iconic for them or iconic for the region. And then when you're doing touristy things, I'm not at all opposed to doing things that are like the standard tourist thing. Many of them are worth seeing. That's why so many people go to see them. But always do one thing that's so unique to the area. Or like, I can only see this here. It just, for me, I love being pushed out of my comfort zone, and that's what this does for me. So those are my little travel challenges for you. I hope that you enjoyed this episode on Miami and this crazy true crime story that is absolutely wild. I'm so excited to see you next week. Please keep the emails coming, the recommendations. You can email them to montyashleymater@gmail.com. This week, I'm going to be launching socials for the Highway to Hell podcast, and we'll be taking things there, and we'll have a email specifically for that. I love your recommendations. I love the feedback. And again, please remember to share this episode on your Facebook wall or on your Instagram story so people know I'm out here. And I will see you next week on the Highway to Hell.